what if we knew in our bones, not just in our heads, that what's comfortable, convenient, and pleasurable today in our lives will not be viable tomorrow because we have breached the limits of the planet, and the planet cannot sustain the levels of violence, consumption, and waste production that are required for these pleasures, comforts, and conveniences. Then, what would we be collectively doing if we could respond? What would those born today, in 30 years' time, look back and say that we did that was helpful?
Welcome to Entangled World, where we explore our interrelated existential, social, economic, ecological, and technological challenges, their underlying drivers, and how a more beautiful world might emerge. I'm your host, Najia Shaukat Lupson. I'm a daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, a mom, and an intersystems thinker. Join me on a journey to discover what is uniquely and meaningfully ours to do at this pivotal moment in time in service to the sacredness of life. Quick note before we get started, if you haven't already listened to the first full episode of this podcast called What is the Meta Crisis, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. It's really a foundational episode that provides a lot of the grounding that is important for all the episodes that follow. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app, or subscribe to the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining me today on the Entangled World podcast. I am so excited to talk with you. Ever since I read your beautiful book that I have here, with you can already see many little flags, I have been dying to talk with you. So thank you so much for taking time to be here.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
I love to start all my conversations with just building a little bit of relationship. So I'd love if you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your story and how you've come to do the work that you do.
Oh my God, where do we start? I am a fallible human being. Maybe that's the best way to get started. Um, in order to get to the part about the work that I do, one of the foundational things is to understand how I was born. And so I was born and raised in Brazil. And my family is like yours, a mixed heritage family. My dad, my dad's family immigrated to Brazil in 1919, and they were. It was about persecution and wars and things like that. And so my dad was born in 1946, and he was the youngest of a large family. And his brothers were involved in agrarian expansion in Brazil. So he grew up listening to stories of indigenous genocide that was deemed necessary for agrarian expansion. And his older brothers were involved with that. And that created in him a social justice impetus to stop that violence. So he decided to marry an indigenous person as a way to stand up to his brothers. But in doing that, he also still believed in the superiority of German culture, right? So this paradox of wanting to change the world while still carrying the imprints of violence, of cultural violence, was very much part of why I came into being. And my mom, on the other hand, my mom was born in the street, um, in the south of Brazil, and she really associated indigeneity with dispossession, with humiliation, and she was really invested in this not being perpetuated across generations. So she really was invested in enfranchisement. So in that context, this kind of genetic whitening was really something that she was looking for. So it was a partnership, also paradoxical on her side,
Mhm.
of wanting social mobility and security, um, through marriage, right? So this historical systemic dissonance, of cultures, was very much from the beginning what created the conditions for my existence. My
Mhm.
grandmother, though, on her side, was very much against all of this. So I also had the stubbornness of a different ontology permeating my upbringing up to the point where she passed away. And so growing up in a family where this dissonance is so, um, present, and the weight of it is also present, right? So you can see, um, violence intertwined with love, with a vision of the future that then me as a child, was actually refusing as well. So I came into the world with a lot of, stubbornness and refusal, which was very much projected as a characteristic of my mom's mom. And from a
Mhm.
German perspective, this needs to be corrected, right? So that you are not going um, to spoil the project of enfranchisement. So I think this upbringing, in a household where violence intertwined with love, was very much what brought me to work in education, and to try to figure out what else we can do apart from the reproduction of violence. I was also a high school dropout. I was, a teenage mom, which was one of the ways that I found of standing up
Mhm.
to, certain forms of expectations and projections. And so I left. I had to leave home, and and see the world very, young, and have to sustain myself and provide for myself very young, in an environment where, it was pretty hard. So the stakes were high about, um, about what we could do. There was a lot of projection that, um, yeah, I was going to end up, in a very difficult situation. And this ability to defy the odds too, in that context, ended up, um, defining also my approach to the work that I do. But mainly it's the paradoxes, I think, that I saw growing up, and what I had to learn to keep myself safe, um, in the middle of a very, very difficult and complex situation, that gave me probably a different way of seeing things and of being,
Mhm.
uh, that, brought to my work in education a perspective that, not many people not many people have. And in the beginning, it was super hard because unless you learn to translate it into something that is, at least basically, meaningful, right, for people, you can't invite them into the reality that you see, or that you're trying to manifest. So I think that's a bit about me. And it's important for me to say that right
Mhm.
now I'm a dean of Faculty of Education located on the unceded lands of the Songhees and the Esquimalt. That's where, the University of Victoria is. And in my journey,
Mhm.
I work a lot with, Indigenous communities in Brazil. I still work a lot with Indigenous communities in Brazil, particularly in the Amazon. So I see that my education actually happened through, the engagement with the Indigenous struggle, which is also complex. And I don't want to present it here in a romanticized way. I generally joke that if you present this idyllic, form of relationality, that is idealized and romanticized, it often doesn't help the struggle. Because
Mhm.
then place their motivation um, in this imagery, right? And it's a very complex struggle, and the pathway actually to a relationality that is entangled with the land that is, the planet, and it's also our bodies. That form of relationality is a path of wisdom that requires discipline, that requires, facing death, that requires changing your relationship with death, with pain, with grief, that requires being present to your shadows. And it's a pathway of maturity and kind of an embracing of aging and eldership that people who believe in the idyllic thing, they do not realize, right? So when
Wow.
they figured out that it's not just this easy consumable thing, then they become very upset. Sometimes they become aggressive even towards you not meeting those expectations.
Thank you so much for sharing a bit about that. I think there's some aspects of your story that resonate with, yeah, like you were saying, my own upbringing and things that we're thinking about. I'd love to start our conversation actually quite broad and ask a pretty big question, and then we'll sort of pick it apart and narrow down a bit, and you can take this any direction that you'd want. But what do you believe is at the root of the many global crises that we're now facing?
I take inspiration from the Huniqui people in the Amazon who are, they have this project called the University of the Forest. And I usually say that that's what I work for. And I'm here as a Dean at UVic undercover. So
I love that.
their understanding of the root of the crisis is the imposed sense of separability between humans and nature. So this imposed sense of separability, it creates layers of problems. And the first one is that it removes the intrinsic value of all life, and that it creates this condition whereby for you to feel deserving of being alive, you need to be producing value in certain economies, right? And
Yeah.
then that you can get the external validation. And it's interesting because they do not see that as just a cognitive issue. It's not a thinking thing. It's a neurophysical, neurobiological thing. So this imposed sense of separation becomes an impairment, a neurobiological impairment that prevents us from accessing forms of well-being that are not defined by the economies imposed by the current system, which I know Daniel calls a superorganism. In the book, I called modernity because it's a because it's a placeholder for a lot of different things and a combination and an assemblage of interconnected things that end up defining what's intelligible as existence, right, for a lot of people. So in the academic literature, you generally find different critiques of the root of the problem. So some people would say it's capitalism, would say it's the Enlightenment type of rationality, others would say it's the formation of the nation state. But if you start with separability, I found that creating an image that actually came as a vision in a ceremony of a house that is exceeding the limits of the planet. So we called it the House of Modernity. And it was funny that when I expressed that as we were talking about the ceremony, that I had this vision of a house, they said, one person said, "Oh, that's the house that the white man built." And now falling apart. So we took that as an inspiration to create a cartography, right? Where you have the planet, and then there's a house built on it. The house is exceeding the limits of the planet. And this house brings together the critiques that you find in academic literature, but it places it on a foundation of separability, which is the separation between and the rest of nature. And that creates what I said to you about the removal of the intrinsic value of life and the creation of the economies to validate the deservedness of life, but it also is what creates the hierarchies between species, between cultures, between peoples. It's what renders the land as property as well. So if you start from that foundation, then you do have in this image two carrying walls. And the first carrying wall is the wall of the modern nation state, which is there to protect property, rather than people. And what we see also in the literature of critical race theory, for example, is that the protection of people, which is generally projected as what the nation state does, is only granted when there's interest convergence between the protection of people and the protection of capital. When there's no interest convergence,
Mhm.
the nation state will return to the protection of capital or property as its main function. And then there's another carrying
Mhm.
wall, which is the carrying wall of Enlightenment humanism, basically, which I summarize as a single story of progress, development, and civilization. That is, and it's a story that presents as universalizing and totalizing, and because of of the forces behind it, which include the military industrial complex, right? It in the educational industrial complex, it
Yeah.
ends up being imposed as a universal view across the world. So it's a story that creates epistemicides. It tries to delegitimize other views of the world, of other perspectives of progress, development, and civilization. It cannot question itself because it sees as the only possible representation of reality. And then other views that challenge that are deemed inferior or backward in that linear progression, right? And in
Mhm.
this linear progression, a certain group of people are placed as heading humanity, while others are placed as lagging behind and in need of help and support to catch up with with the project to get into the bandwagon. Or and then if they refuse to do that, they are perceived to be dragging progress, development, civilization, and therefore they are not deemed worthy of being alive.
Mhm.
So that there's a foundation, the two carrying walls, and then the roof is one of like today's roof is one of algorithmic shareholder speculative capitalism. And it is
Yeah.
recently created roof that is more problematic than other roofs that have been proposed or that happened before, like industrial capitalism, right? Because of the
Mhm.
anonymity of shareholders and this sense of like corporations' fiduciary obligation to shareholders of maximizing profit. And instead of placing this critique as something that only the 1% of the richest people do, what we've tried to do with this image is to say we're all implicated in this. If you have a credit card, if you participate in the financial system, and we don't have a choice
Yeah.
to to opt out, right? We are also invested in this profit making, even to be thinking about our pensions and retirements, right? So it's a
Yep.
whole system that is created that is pretty tight, that makes it almost impossible for you to opt out of it. But then we say the house has breached the limits of the planet, and in any case, growth-based economies in a finite planet are not possible.
Mhm.
So, what's happening is that the house is cracking, and this latest roof of the house of global speculative capitalism is structurally damaged and is creating all kinds of problems in terms of the house falling apart, and then placing us in a position to ask then what now, right? Because the
Mhm.
expansion of the house requires more of the expropriation, exploitation, extraction, and then because of that destitution, dispossession, genocide, and ecocide that is necessary. So if the expansion is impossible, if the sewage of the house is flooding the planet and the house itself, then what? And then at
Mhm.
that point, we also have to ask, for us who have been conditioned to expect the house and the comforts and conveniences of the house, can we even imagine anything else,
Yeah.
right? When we try to
Yeah.
fix this. And is it about fixing it or is it about something else?
Mm. Yeah. Maybe let's we'll come back to a few things because there's a bunch of different questions I have, but before we get there, um One of the things that you talk about in your book is that we are living in a unique time where our current systems are breaking down and dying, and we are, called to give birth to a new world. But in order to not recreate the mistakes of the past, that we need to compost our shit. And I love the metaphor because I think it's so perfect. But to really understand the mistakes we've made, what we've done to each other and the planet so that we may learn and work to create something new. And I know you're working on a new book, a kind of follow-up to your first where you explore how we might navigate in these times of meta crisis, which is really the core intention behind this podcast. So I'd love if maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview of maybe how your thinking has evolved since you wrote your first book, and then the big question of what do you think we, the big we of humanity, needs to do in this time?
Okay, I'll try.
Just a small
Um,
question, you know?
that's a small question. Yes. So in Hospicing Modernity, we did talk about the importance of giving palliative care to the dystopic house, right? That is crumbling, and give it a good death with dignity and integrity, and that requires us to be able to see, to face the human wrongs, right?
Mhm,
And in facing human wrong, we also need to face the molecular nature of colonialism as the separation between us and the rest of nature. So, and as we do that, we're asked to also be attentive, or to attend to, or both, be attentive and attend to the prenatal care we need to offer to the new that is being born. And what we say, but not enough in the first book, that is that this birth may not be a human centered one, right?
mhm,
So
mhm,
taking inspiration again from the communities we work with in the global south, part of the work of a midwife is to get out of the way of this baby,
mhm,
right? Is to
mhm,
nurture the possibility of this, a healthy birth and a healthy baby, while not suffocating the baby with projections and idealization for this baby, and also while attending to the family. And if we're thinking about this baby also as a product of violence, right? What is it that we need to do to secure the safety of this baby and the well-being of this baby in very difficult conditions of the mother and the father, this mother and father not being necessarily human, right? Being something that maybe the earth itself is birthing, and it's dreaming through us and other beings. And then in this in this flow, we are also designed by the earth. So how do we get, part of the question is, how do we get our ego out of the way,
mhm.
right? And nurture the kind of humility that requires the shedding of arrogance that we've learned in the anthropocentric, human centered house of modernity. And that is generally underestimated, the amount of composting of
Yeah,
shit that is
yeah,
required
by R.R.
for us, the shedding of the arrogance. So in the new book, the basic question of the new, there are three questions that drive the new book. The first one is, and it is a book about education basically. What if we knew in our bones, not just in our heads, that what's comfortable, convenient, and pleasurable today in our lives will not be viable tomorrow because we have breached the limits of the planet, and the planet cannot sustain the levels of violence, consumption, and waste production that are required for these pleasures, comforts, and conveniences, right? Then what would we be collectively doing if we could respond, and if we could is important,
Yeah,
from a space
yeah.
of emotional sobriety. So that's the S. It's called, in the end you'll see it's the SMDR compass. So it's emotional sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, including our capacity to face and navigate complexity, and intergenerational and interspecies responsibility. So S is sobriety, M is maturity, D is discernment, and R is responsibility. So that's the second question. Then the third question is, what would those born today, in 30 years' time, look back and say that we did that was helpful now,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So the book then invites us all, not just, but we're all educators, we're parents, grandparents, we're uncles and aunties, right? And we're responsible for a
Yeah.
bigger family than just our nuclear families that are, it's not a family of just human and human beings. How do we grow up, basically, and
Yeah.
show up differently to each other? But going back to the second question, right? When you asked me, like, what do we need to do now? The answer from that perspective would be, we need to get to a place where we can respond with emotional sobriety,
Mm.
relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and intergenerational and interspecies responsibility. And a huge part of it is about humility. And the book, then, the subtitle of the book is Navigating Complexity, Complicity, and Collapse with Compassion and Accountability.
It makes me think about this question, that you explore in your book about, those born today, 30 years from now, what would they say was helpful? It's something I've been thinking quite a lot about, particularly because I have a young son who is going to experience this
Mhm,
collapse. And I think about, and one of the things I've started to do is I've been sort of writing letters to his future self, sort of
mhm,
like, what can I share with you? What wisdom, what can I say to you about these times that might help you, 20 years from now when you hopefully read these letters at some point, to help you navigate this world. And um it's heartbreaking.
mhm. I'll tell you a story. So I'm at the point of finishing the book. So we're writing it as a collective, but like, a lot of the writing um, is on my shoulders. Um, and a couple of days ago, the conversations are here, right, about what we're talking about in the book. And the youngest member of our collective is 3 years old.
Mhm.
Um, and we've had a recent death in our collective, in the family, and it was her greatest friend. It was a huge dog called Geisha, and she was such a huge presence because she was definitely huge in size, in spirit, and personality. And so, as this child is processing the death of a huge friend, she had been asking questions about death all the time, right? What death is, what death means. And as we are discussing the book, so she's picking up the death of everything. So at one point, she said, "What happened when everything dies?" And we said, "Oh, um, we will go in the earth will be fine. All the other beings, and they're shape shifting there, so there's life beyond death." And she's like, "No, no, no, no. I don't. I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about that moment, that the transition moment, right?" And then we looked at her and said, "We
Mm.
don't know. Wait, and what do you think?" And she came up with an image, and the image was, the first thing that came up was a tree playing the piano.
Huh.
So we stopped with that and I said, "Okay, what else is happening around the tree?" And she said, "There is a rabbit playing the guitar while throwing bricks." I said, "Okay, mischievous rabbit, this one." And then she looked at me and she said, "And you, Vanessa, you will be a giraffe playing the pandeiro, which is a Brazilian percussionist instrument made of aubergines. And my dad will be an elephant singing, and I will be at the drums as a dog. And the rest of the collective, her mom and all the other people, are going to be dancing." And it just struck us in such a way that
Mm.
like helped us to see what am I going to be doing at the end of the world? And that party is actually quite quite a good thing for us to think about. But reflecting deeper on this, there's a much deeper teaching in that, and we've been working with that for the book. And what I can say you about my reflection today is that, so in modernity, we use imagination in a very in wordings, in language in a very specific way. So because of the pattern of modernity is to project a teleology, an image of the future with fixed form and fixed meanings, right? That we work towards. That's
Mhm.
the planning, engineering foundation of our civilization, our Western civilization, right? That we can engineer a world that is going to be perfect, and maybe that is going to
Mhm.
conquer not just land and nature but also death, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the way this child was using imagination is very different.
Yes.
So she was using imagination, in my understanding, as creating a vibrational field.
Ah.
It was making sense through nonsense, right?
Yeah.
To create movement and rhythm and a party where the form of being shapeshifted into something else and invited us into the rhythm of it, right?
Mhm.
Into the entanglement of it. So we actually finished the book with a reflection on that, of what she's asking us to do, right? From where we are at
Mm.
now. So in the book, we explore this. One of the chapters is about relationality, and generally we have used relationality in modern cultures, in academic literature, as in opposition to something else, because that's the binary thinking, right? So
Mhm.
relationality, and then there's something that is not relational that it opposes, right? But if you come from this stand standpoint and stand being of everything is entangled.
Yeah.
Nothing is not relational, right? So
Yeah.
there's only relationality. So modernity has a kind of relationality. So when everything is relational, the question is not is there relationality or not? It's what kind of relationality, what kind of tethering we have with one another, with the world, with our own selves. What's the tether? And so in this chapter, we talk about the kind of tethering that we have in modernity is one that is transactional, right? So I relate to you in a transactional way. So even in the podcast, I'm here speaking to you, and then there's this idea of visibility, right? So there
Uh-huh.
is this transactional tether. And if I don't get what I want, and I don't give you what you want, and there's a ledger basically of what I give and of what I take.
Mhm.
And then we contrast this, which is it's paradoxical because in order for us to make it intelligible, you have to use the dialectics of modernity, right?
Mhm.
So we contrast this with something that we called whole shebang relationality. So it's entanglement relationality. But when we say entanglement, people usually imagine this harmonious thing where everything is connected. And we wanted to use whole
Uh-huh.
shebang because whole shebang is messy, right? It refers to everything, everywhere, all at once, all of the time. And not and doesn't bring this word at this point doesn't bring the sense of harmony and resolution that the word entanglement is already evoking. So I've been using the word entanglement before, and people say, "Oh, Yes, it's the connection with everything. But I know that we are trained to want connection with only what's beautiful. So they want to
Yeah.
connect the moon, the stars, the sun, and the whales, but not the shit,
Yeah.
right? So they want to skip the shit into a rainbow. And we need to interrupt that,
Yeah.
that desire to go into the rainbow. We still need the rainbow, but we need the rainbow to compost the shit, not as an escape from the rainbow, from the shit. The rainbow cannot be escape from the shit. And when we are in processes of creating the new, what we're saying in the book too is that if we don't start with the shit, it's not a starter, right? Because it's the soil of it's the soil that emerges through the composting that will give us what's genuinely possible beyond what can be imagined today. If we're
Mm.
trying to imagine, especially in the ways that we use imagination, we're going to imagine the same in different clothes, right? And
Yeah.
try to bring everybody there through compelling visions that require consensus and all of that. And this is not working right now because the house is falling apart and coherent consensus is becoming much more elusive, right? So back to whole shebang
Yeah.
relationality. uh, It is a form of connecting to the whole that requires different dimensions. So back to what Daniel talks about, and we draw on Daniel's distinction between moving from narrow boundary intelligence to wide boundary intelligence to wisdom. But we put a twist in it because we've been working with communities in the South that have a specific take on what wisdom is.
Mm.
The in the Amazon, they call it, when we presented this as we were working with the University of the Forest Project. And one of the people in the Amazon, Chief Ninawaho Nikui, he said, this is an amazing gift from Daniel, right? This
Mm.
It's kind of a wireframe that allows us to talk about certain things that we were struggling with before, because he looked at wisdom and he said that's Yushibu, and Yushibu is the quantum force that animates everything. And he really went for that. So we started to work with it, probably as a reinterpretation of what Daniel did, but we're very grateful that we received this gift too. So in our current reflections on what this process is, and this process is not linear, it's a nested process, right? So narrow boundary intelligence, and also the definition of intelligence that Daniel puts forward as goal optimization was also super useful, right? So
Mhm.
intelligence as goal optimization and directional single accountability. So in our current system within modernity, it's profit or utility maximization, and it is very much an either or position. It works through hierarchical binaries. If you challenge the binary, it becomes a reversal of binaries, and it's very two dimensional, right? Now, what the way we see wide boundary intelligence is that instead of either or, we're talking about both and more and moving, and in the diffraction of layers and complexity, and the ability to hold complexity without freaking out, right? And it's a
Mm.
three-dimensional way of operating. So, and then when we're thinking about wisdom, we also really like the idea of this visceral responsibility or commitment to the whole. And Chief Ninawa defines the whole as visible and invisible matter, motion, and mystery.
Mm.
So the three M's: matter, motion, and mystery of the whole. And in that that state, it it not it's not that it's not it's two-dimensional, three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional, fifth-dimensional, plus unlimited dimensions, right? So you're aware of the impossibility of totalization or universalization of narrative
Mhm.
too. It's like, as you see with the Tao, if you say it, it's not it because it's already in movement. So
Mhm.
it requires a very different presence to reality than two or three dimensions. And then we talk about the fact that in two dimensions, if you bring in a three-dimensional object, so if you're in a two-dimensional plane, you bring in a three-dimensional object, for the two-dimensional plane, it can only be seen as a shadow, right?
Mm.
So imagine the two-dimensional plane, I bring my thing, and then it's the shadow of it that is there, right? My
Uh-huh.
mouse to it. So in that sense, the move from two dimensions to three dimensions, we need to breathe depth into things, right? Because that the third dimensional thing is depth. And this breathing of depth is initially very painful because you have to blow something outwards, right? And inward too. There's the
Mm.
inward and then outwards that doesn't exist in a flat plane. So, and then similarly, if you are already in a three-dimensional plane, and if you bring in the fourth dimension of time and the fifth dimension of space into it, we can't fathom it, and it can only be accessed through holograms, right? Or the representation of a tesseract, that is things morphing into a geometrical field that morphs into itself. So it's very difficult to try to pin down wisdom in two or three dimensions. The best we can do is to have narratives that point towards it, that gesture towards it. It's like the finger pointing to the moon.
Mhm.
However, people want the finger; they don't want the moon,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Keep pointing, and they think they got it, and they feel that if they intellectually can repeat it, they already there, which is very different. So it's like people want the map rather than walk and move into the path with bare feet and naked and open to the elements, right? So what we found in dealing with this educational issues, right? So the educational task then would be to move humanity from narrow boundary intelligence to wide boundary intelligence. That space is what I've been working on with my collective, but it's not just that. We still need either breadcrumbs or sprinkles of wisdom in it. Otherwise, we are also closed off in wide boundary, because then we think that by understanding complexity, we can still engineer, and that the arrogance comes back,
Yeah.
right? We are in control here, or our certainties will get us where we need to go. And the wisdom pathway requires you to live with the entanglement, uncertainty, matter, motion, and mystery of the whole shebang, right?
Mm.
Which is in fact inaccessible as an intellectual project. And when you try to access it, so for example, when people go out and say, okay, let's capture the wisdom of indigenous people, they generally bring it back to two-dimensional thinking, and it becomes indigenous knowledge in a box, right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
translates it back into either two dimensions or three dimensions, and it can't move us and itself in a way that takes us into this other whole shebang dance with everything, everywhere, all at once, and all the time. So the educational task, if you ask me, what do we need to do right now? We need a minimum of collective wide boundary with breadcrumbs or sprinkles of wisdom.
Mm.
In
Mm.
educationally, this is a tall order that we then represent like as a compass through the emotional sobriety, relational maturity, intellectual discernment, and interspecies and intergenerational responsibility.
I think, this point that you're raising of trying to sort of imagine regenerative futures, or this sort of future utopia or protopia, whatever you want to call it, from the current place that we sit, and the risks of doing that, I think is so important, because you hear that all the time, right? That we just need a clear vision of what the regenerative future is going to be look like. We have too many visions from Hollywood and movies and shows about dystopia. We don't have enough about utopia. And recognizing, it goes back to the story that you were sharing about the 3-year-old who sort of imagined something that was so different from anything that an adult probably would have ever imagined if you ask them, like, what is the better future going to look like? And so it kind of brings me back to the point that you made about breadcrumbs. So then how do we leave these breadcrumbs in a way that interrupts our sort of like colonial habits of being? How do we how do we leave the breadcrumbs?
Yeah. And how do we be differently? Basically, that's the question,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and how do we do? Because most of the people who are thinking about these issues, myself included, are sitting in our comfortable homes of modernity with the luxury of producing a podcast and being able to think and write and talk about these topics, and so if the people who are thinking about these issues are those people, it feels to me like we're sort of in this trap, right? Like we're in this, like, house of mirrors, and so how do we get out
Mhm.
of that?
That's a good question. I think that's the quest. Right?
Yeah.
That's the quest
Yeah.
we're in together. And there are many different layers, but as you were mentioning, people trying to imagine futures, maybe shifting the way we relate to imagination, and instead of trying to project objective forms into the future, taking the lessons from the 3-year-old, how do we project vibrational fields? And then from that vibrational field work backwards to what vibrational field are we in right now, or trapped in, like where are we stuck, and how do we create the flexibility and movement rather than the form and certainty and control to get into a healthier vibrational field of well-being, rather than trying to fixate or determine, over determine what it's going to be, right? How do
Mhm.
we work in an adaptive way, an emergent way towards something that is movement rather than form? And that is already a shift in being that goes against our training, right? Everything
Yeah.
everywhere trains us
Yeah.
and rewards us
Yeah.
to do things in a different way. And the problem, as the Hunikui in the Amazon say, is that it's libidinal. So it our pleasure experiences are linked to reproducing what's toxic,
Mm.
and that is much more difficult to shift than, for example, if we felt it as harmful, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Then we would have a defense mechanism against it. But if we feel it as comfortable, convenient, and pleasurable, then it's more akin to an addiction, and then
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
process becomes a rehabilitation. But we already know that rehabilitation only happens when there is also a movement of dissatisfaction with the weight of the addiction, and it requires sometimes the so-called rock bottom, or that somebody really like the amount of energy and labor required to interrupt this neural pathway is incredible. It's and some people would say, for many people it's impossible, right?
Mm.
And then looking at it, and it's interesting because if you look at it as a disease, like a disease, um, number one, it brings compassion. Number two, it brings the mirror, because we're also in there. But it opens up other possibilities of thinking about collective healing and well-being that are not there if you're thinking about it as fight, or something to be fixed, right? Something to be healed is different. It's a different story. And in looking at it molecularly, so it is important too. So in the book, there is a chapter about molecular colonialism, where we identified seven seven patterns of being within modernity that are rewarded, that and then seven patterns of political practice that are also intelligible, that are very difficult to interrupt if you don't really pay attention to what they do, and then lose the satisfaction you have with it, right, with them. So the patterns of being are to do with we framed it as 7 A's. We love like alliterations and metaphors because it's easier to remember,
Easier to
but it's
remember.
7 A's. We just, yeah. The first A is epistemic and moral authority, right? So it's something that is perceived to be a desirable desire, right? To have epistemic and moral authority. That's the A. And that authority leaves us in a position to arbitrate. So that's the second A, arbitration of truth, beauty, lawfulness, and common sense. Then the third A is the A of the affirmation of innocence, virtue, benevolence, um, and so innocence, virtue, benevolence, and goodness, that then takes us to a position where we can desire and claim um, unrestricted and unaccountable autonomy to do whatever we want without consequence. And these four A's then also ground the other three. So if we have authority, autonomy, arbitration, the affirmation of goodness, we can appropriate and accumulate, right? Capital of all kinds of
Yeah.
different forms, and then accelerate, that's the last a single narrative of progress, development, and civilization, placing us at the apex of evolution, right? So it becomes a kind of a package of being that is molecular, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it's if you deviate from that, you become unintelligible, and that usually placed as madness, right? Because then you're not, and that's very much what my parents were worried about me as I was growing up. So they saw what I was doing in terms of challenging the dynamics, the vibrational field that I had in my house of love and violence, as a form of madness rather than neurodivergence, right? And me trying to navigate out of that vibrational field. And then they were worried that I would die as nobody in the middle of nowhere, just like my indigenous Guarani grandmother did. So that there's no significance in your life
Mhm.
if you do not abide by the
Mhm.
7 A's.
Mhm.
And then if you're thinking about the 7 A's in relationship to the form of politics that they engender, you have 7 E's. It's very useful to for memory, especially during premenopause. So the 7 E's are the first E. Our politics is grounded on exceptionalism, right? So not just human exceptionalism, but the exceptionalism of a person or of a group of people who have the answers and who will lead us out of this of the mess we're in. And then the second one is exaltedness. So we need to praise this group or this person for all its virtues and place them beyond reproach so that they can have the heroic archetype to be able to have that position to be the leaders in this quest. So exceptionalism, exaltedness, and then we have externalization of culpability. So the group or the leader is in the good team, where fighting the forces of evil that we vilify that are out there. So very contrary to this whole shebang thing, right? So there's always
Yeah.
the binary, who's the good, who's the bad, and who's out there that I need to fight. So in the left or the right, you will find different positions of who's to blame, but it's the same
Mhm.
process, right? And it could be a scapegoat or not, but it's the same process. So exaltedness, exceptionalism, externalization of culpability, escape from responsibility, which goes with expansion of entitlements. So the politics is based on entitlements to more entitlement,
Right.
and escaping from these entitlements, also commanding responsibilities. We focus on the entitlement, not on responsibility. And the last E, I think we're already in the last E, is it's emancipation from entanglement, right? So we use
Yeah.
emancipation as a word, and rightly so, in terms of oppressive forces, right? So many groups that have been subject to oppressive forces talk about emancipation from this type of power relation that subjugates them or that steals from them or exploits them. But at the end of the day, we cannot emancipate from the earth, right? Although some people,
Yeah.
desperate people, do want to do
Yeah.
that.
Oh, there's people
Um,
working on it.
there's people working on it. Makes it, or maybe even it proves the point. So emancipation from entanglement is also what they are doing,
Yeah,
right?
and from
It
responsibility.
and from
Yeah.
responsibility,
Like, leave this
and
earth charred behind, I don't care,
yeah,
as long as me and my consciousness can live on forever
yeah,
in
yeah.
space. Yeah.
It's interesting when we were in another ceremony,
Mm.
and somebody had a dream about a vision about a potential a potential story that we would write. We haven't done it yet, but it was a story called what's it? Human carbonicus, like Homo carbonicus, and it would be in the future,
Oh.
300 years from now, and people would be living under the earth and with a very different diet. So they would have adapted, and a lot of the diet was us being able to eat mycelium. So we would become mushrooms, basically, partly. I think we already are, but we would become more mushroom than we are at the moment. So, and then they would have found the vault where people had been cryogenically
Mhm.
frozen,
Uh-huh.
right? And we would still have technology because the mushrooms would have helped us. But it would be different biotechnology. And then these beings would say, "Oh my God, do we can we wake up these people, or should we wake up these people?" And then they would start telling the story of these
Yeah.
people who tried to do different things because they felt exceptionally superior to everybody else, and they had the means at the time to mobilize technology to do that. And they used these beings to understand what had happened with Homo carbonicus at the
Mm.
time. And it was so funny because the kinds of questions were like, if we wake them up, they're not gonna like it to be under the earth and eat mycelium. That's
The
number
cycle
one.
of
I thought,
domination would just start again.
I know. And then they thought, well, they were sick. It's time. Will we bring the sickness back?
Yeah.
Exactly as you said, right? So how how but they would have given us some insight into how on earth we got to this point,
Mm.
right?
Mhm. There's, something you said earlier that, you also wrote about in your book that was just so fascinating to me was this hypothesis that you're proposing, which is, you talk about how neuroscientists who study psychotropic plants like
Mhm,
mushrooms used in ceremonies by indigenous communities see serotonin as one of the key chemicals that gives us, our sense of connection with everything else. And your hypothesis is that modernity imposes this separability by design and actually impacts the production and absorption of serotonin, leaving us to feel even greater separation.
mhm,
And this was so fascinating to me because I've never sort of heard about it talked about in this way. So can you talk to me a little bit more about this? Because I agree with you that in all of my studies, what I've sort of come to at the root of the problem is our perceived separation with all of life around us. And so I'm curious as to if there's a neurobiological element to it. Is there something we can do in the near term to
mhm,
sort of address this imbalance, right, that
mhm,
exists in us?
mhm. So I'll just preface it. I'm not a neuroscientist. I
Yeah.
don't want to be a neuroscience.
And
And
I know I'm
neuroscience,
not looking for, like, a silver bullet solution, but I am curious as to I guess I'm curious as to both what we can do, but also, like, what are the ways in which our neurobiology is affected by our current environment, right? Like, one of the things I think about is, even when you were talking about the house of modernity, and in my mind, I think of a house and I think of a box, and I think
mhm,
of, something that's sort of square, and those are the environments that most of us are inside
yeah,
of most of the days. Like, why don't we have circular buildings? Why did we decide to build buildings as boxes, right? And so, how is even something like that affecting our neurobiology and how we see things?
yeah, yeah. No, It's an incredibly important question, and the preface is important because the neuroscience is also imbued with all the biases of modernity, right?
Yeah.
So using that language to talk about something that gestures somewhere else is problematic, but it's also super necessary, right? And that's why the caveat there.
Mhm.
So the House of Modernity uses dopamine to keep us hooked,
Mhm.
right? If you think about algorithmic capitalism, that's what's playing with oxytocin as well. So cat videos and cute animal, like cute babies, cute everything. Well, animals are babies. Babies are animal, but any cute baby of any kind of animal just creates that charge and keeps us hooked. It also uses adrenaline and cortisol in specific ways to keep us tied to its economies. But then the question is, if we're designed by that right now, what other forms of well-being are available through a design that is more earth-based,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That the earth itself comes in. But we we talk about exiled capacities in our
Mm.
projects. So capacities that have been exiled from the House of Modernity. And in our training, in our research training with Indigenous communities, when we started, we were interested in what kind of education, for example, in the Amazon, then a baby is born, and this community, for this community survival and survivance, it relies on this baby being being able to establish a visceral connection with the biome, right? So that it can fight for its survival as the survival of the biome. So it will place his life on the line to protect the forest. And that so how do we get to that kind of education of visceral responsibility, which is not an intellectual choice, it's
Mhm.
visceral. And then one of the things we were told is that, okay, so in contrast with education in Western society or in modern societies, uh, that educates the head, so that the modern education educates the head so that the body follows. Their education was about educating the gut
Mhm.
so that the heart is filled and the head follows. And in conversations about this translation in between educations, right? What came up too is that there is in the gut there is an umbilical cord that connects which is the tether that connects us to everything and to the core of everything, and that umbilical cord cannot be twisted, right?
Mhm.
It has to be tended to in a way that it's nurturing, and that this nurturance is also it's the vibrational antenna basically of things that vibrationally circulate within between and within our bodies, connecting us to, it's not even the word connection doesn't cut it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
turntable connection is
Yeah.
like,
It like evokes this in modernity, it evokes this image of like two things
mm,
coming together and there's like a node, which is
yes,
yeah.
rather than a nested thing what everything is everything, we don't know where we
Yeah.
finish and the other thing starts, right? So we have to always say there's a
Right.
caveat. We're using language that is already grounded ontologically and separably, and to make things intelligible, the translation has to mobilize this language to gesture towards something else, but you have to be able to dance with it to be able to go with into something else. If you're looking at form, you're not going to get it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we are over time, so I guess my last question for you just would be who would you like to platform on this podcast or who would you recommend to come on?
Who would I recommend to come on? That's a good, I would have to sit with the question for some time. The first person to platform with, in my mind, the first person that came is the child that I told you about.
I was thinking it too. I
Mhm.
was like, that was actually amazing. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. And I hope that, yeah, I hope we can continue to stay in touch and continue this conversation. Um, I think there's so much more to dig into. I had actually wanted to dig much more into education and parenting, but we didn't have time to get there. So maybe we maybe we can do a follow-up conversation at some
At
point.
another time. Agreed. Thank you.
Wonderful. If you liked the episode and want to hear more conversations where we explore how a more beautiful world might emerge, subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app or the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. If you loved it, support the project at patreon.com/Entangled World. Thank you for listening and for coming on this journey together.